Hello, welcome to chapter 21. We are going to start now heavily to talk about the diseases. So we're going to start with talking about diseases of the skin and diseases of the eyes, which in the microbiome sense, we learned it before that it's a continuation of the skin, right? The eye conjunctiva. So we're going to divide this video in 3 parts, being one of them where we talk about skin structure, what's a normal microbiota for skin, and then bacterial skin infections. And then in the second video we talk about viral skin infections, and in the third video we talk about fungal and parasitic diseases and eye infections, which are mostly bacterial. So starting with this part 1, we're going to talk about how skin is, the layers of the skin are, and what is important in skin to keep microbes away, and in the mucous membranes, types of rashes, and then the 4 main types or main etiology of skin infection. So let's start by talking about what is important in the skin that gives that property of the skin, which is protection. So we have in the epidermis, we have a stratified squamous epithelium, and in that epithelium, remember how the cells from the bottom part of the epithelium can grow, and as they grow, they accumulate keratin inside them, and keratin is also a molecule in progression as the cell is evolving. And let's see if we can try this. So that's the epidermis here, right? Right here. Epidermis is this. This top part here is the part that is dead. So why is it dead? Because as I was saying, these cells are producing keratin, and as keratin matures, the cell gets to a point that the protein content inside the cell is too big for the cell to deal with and for that to be compatible with life. So the cell dies, and then it forms what we call stratum corneum, and the stratum corneum, which is this part, is really rich in keratin. So under the epidermis, what we have is the dermis, and in the dermis, that's where we have blood vessels, right? Blood vessels, immune cells. Why do we have immune cells in the dermis? Try to think about that. Dermis is made of connective tissue, remember? So this is epithelial tissue here, and then from here down we have connective tissue, and connective tissue is known for having macrophages and cells that are going to eat the debris and fight diseases that could reach that layer of the skin. Let's recap one thing that is important here as we talk about the structures. Now we're going to talk about structures that are like embedded in the skin. And one of them is the hair follicle. And the hair follicle has what here? The sebaceous gland, right? All this is a sebaceous gland. It's right here, oil gland, produces sebum. And this gland produces sebum, oil. And what is oil? Oil is made of fatty acids, and fatty acids are acidic. So I'm already giving you a tip of something that is going to keep microbes away. Most of microbes don't like that acidic environment, so they just keep away from it, right? They die, or they just don't go there. They don't try to go there. Some microbes will like it, and then we're going to talk about those too. And then another structure that is embedded but that has an opening to the outside is this guy here, the sweat gland, right? That produces sweat, perspiration. So the sweat gland has a duct that opens to the skin. If it's merocrine gland. The apocrine glands are usually open to a hair follicle. Those are the ones that produce the stinky sweat, right? If you remember this from A&P. So what's important here is that these glands are also, they can keep microbes away by the way I said, acidic environment. In the case of the sweat glands, they can keep microbes away because sweat has lysozyme. And sweat also has IgA, immunoglobulin A. So all this all the substances are going to fight microbes, right? Lysozyme breaks down bacterial cell wall. IgA is going to tag bacteria so macrophages can eat them. So all this is important to keep microbes away. The fact that there is liquid here flushing out is another way to keep microbes away, right? But the fact is that some microbes like to live inside these ducts and inside the hair follicle. So when we talk about skin microbiota as being on the surface of the skin, that's correct. But a lot of these microbes will like even to live inside these embedded structures. So microbes, for example, like Staphylococcus, Propionibacterium. Propionibacterium is anaerobe, so they like to live inside structures like the hair follicle. Okay, so they will thrive in, you know, in other places, not just on the surface of the skin. They can also live, Staphylococcus likes to live in the sweat because the sweat is salty, and they are halophiles, remember, so they don't mind living in conditions like this. Okay, so we talked about all this. Let's move on to mucous membrane. So remember that the eye is a continuation of the skin when it comes to the layer, right? When it comes to the conjunctiva, which is a mucous membrane. So the membrane that covers the cornea and the sclera on the front, on the anterior portion of your eye, is made of very tightly packed epithelial cells, and these cells can secrete mucus, okay? And also you have other oils that are present in the eye that are going to be important to keep microbes away, the same way that tears do that, because tears have lysozyme and IgA, okay? The same way as sweat. Remember also the mucous membranes, we're going to talk later, how they're also present in every hollow organ system, like the reproductive, digestive, urinary, and systems, right? So these microbes that grow on the skin, the majority of them belong to the genera Staphylococci and Micrococci. Okay, so remember that these bacteria are both halophiles, meaning they like salt, different from other bacteria. And areas with moisture, such as in between legs and armpit, are going to have a bigger population of these microbes. Other bacteria that are also part of the normal microbiota are Propionibacterium, like I said. A lot of times Propionibacterium are present, but they're not pathogenic. Depending on the strain of Propionibacterium, they're going to be more pathogenic, and then they can cause acne. So remember that the Propionibacterium that causes acne belongs to a group under species, which we call strain, that could have more virulent factors than the ones from people that don't develop acne, okay? Also, hormonal changes will induce or propitiate this bacteria to be pathogenic, okay? Because then the excess of oil production due to the high hormones during puberty would be a factor that also contributes. We also have Malassezia furfur, which is an yeast that can cause dandruff present on the skin as a part of the normal microbiome. So now we have skin rashes that we want to talk about because we're going to try to identify them later. So we have vesicle being a little structure, round structure filled with fluid, little bag, right? Filled with fluid in the epidermis. When that bag becomes bigger and still filled with fluid, bigger than 1 centimeter, you call it bulla. When it's just a redness in the skin on the epidermis that is visible, right, through the skin, that redness is called macule. And when you have a vesicle that forms in the dermis and is filled with liquid, you call that papule. Sometimes lymphocytes migrate to this type of vesicles and form what we call pus. And then instead of papule, you call it pustule. Examples here. Vesicles you can find in chickenpox, for example, hand, mouth, and foot disease that is common in children. Bulla is common to see in scalded skin syndrome produced by Staphylococcus aureus. Macules are present in rubella, and measles. And pustule is what we see in acne. Okay, it is formed in the hair follicle, so that starts in the dermis, and it is the main component of that lesion, of that rash, is pus. So in the staphylococcal skin infection, one thing that is going to be important here is to notice that some bacteria, usually the Staph aureus, is going to be the one that is coagulase positive. Remember coagulase, what it is? Coagulase, when in contact with the plasma, will make a capsule, like a jelly, around the bacterial cell. That's the bacterial cell, right? And then that capsule will protect against the immune system. Okay, so it's going to be an isolation. That's a virulent factor that Staphylococcus aureus present, but not Staphylococcus epidermidis in general. Okay, so this is usually important to determine if there is Staphylococcus and what species it is present in a specific sample. The Staph epidermidis usually causes healthcare associated infections. It is present as 90% of the normal skin microbiome, so it's super important as maintenance of the skin. But it can produce biofilm on catheters, and that's one thing that associates it with a nosocomial infection, and that is coagulase negative. The type of infections caused by Staph epidermidis are not that different from the ones caused by Staph aureus in intensity or type. Staph aureus are carried usually in the nasal passages of 20% of the population. They grow, they are coagulase positive. They have evasion mechanisms that include lysozyme resistance. So even if the sweat has lysozyme, they're not going to die because of that substance. Resistance to opsonization. Remember the complement system of the immune system trying to kill them, and they're not going to be affected. And they survive inside phagosomes. Okay, they can be transported by the hair follicle, and when they inflame, when they cause an inflammation in the hair follicle, they can cause what's called folliculitis. Okay, and folliculitis has different shapes that we're gonna see in a minute. One important bacterium that grew or was created due to the overuse of antimicrobials is the MRSA. So MRSA is, let's write it down here. MRSA means methicillin resistant Staphylococcus aureus. For some reason, my pen is not working. And MRSA is resistant to methicillin. So remember that DISC, antimicrobial DISC assay. So you see how the bacteria grow, all the bacteria is all this whitish part, right? It grows all around all these antimicrobials, erythromycin, penicillin, sulfa, and methicillin, but is avoided by the vancomycin. So MRSA is resistant to methicillin, but not to vancomycin, okay? The problem is that with that, you create other pathogens that can become resistant. So there is an Enterococcus bacterial species that is resistant to vancomycin and is causing other types of nosocomial infection, and that came with the attempt to destroy MRSA, okay? So MRSA is important because it can be transmitted by fomite and not necessarily in hospitals. It can be transmitted like in gym facilities, in places where you share equipment. So it's important to keep that in mind. So the main staphylococcal skin infections caused by either S. aureus or S. epidermidis would be folliculitis, which is the infection in the hair follicle. When the hair follicle is on the eyelash, then you call it stye. You can also have by staphylococcal boil, which is an abscess that is usually surrounded by pus and inflammatory tissue. And carbuncle, which is a damage and inflammation of the deep tissue from that boil that is spreading. So when boil spreads, you have what's called carbuncle, so it's a even bigger lesion. Impetigo, which is mostly common in kids, and it's a non-bullous. Remember, it doesn't form bulla. It's just crusting from destruction of those little vesicles on the skin, and those crusting sores can be spread to other regions of the skin of the baby by autoinoculation. I think I have a picture of this here. So this is impetigo. You see, it's just that scaling of the skin that started with vesicles. So it's mostly in the epidermis. But then Staphylococcus can inherit a toxin. So then it's a strain that is more virulent that produces a toxin that they probably inherited from some virus or some other bacteria. And that's called toxin B, or exfoliative toxin B. That toxin causes exfoliation, and then you would have the bullous impetigo. And the name of that is scalded skin syndrome. So in scalded skin syndrome, you do have bulla, okay? Another super important and very dangerous infection caused by Staphylococcus is toxic shock syndrome, TSS. So what is toxic shock syndrome? I have the diagram here for you. So one way that is described as very frequent in the literature is that in women, the use of high absorbent tampons, vaginal tampons, would dry the environment of the vagina. And remember how Staphylococcus likes the dryness, right? They are halophiles. If there's a high concentration of solutes and not enough water, they're totally okay with that. So they will grow around that tampon that is making that environment super dry. Parenthesis, the tampon, for this to happen, is probably in use for hours and hours, not removed and, you know, the region cleaned and put a new one. So when tampons are used for longer period of times, you can have staph that comes from the skin, grow in here, and they quickly reach the bloodstream, because remember how vagina and cervix of the uterus are very highly irrigated by blood. And they will reach the bloodstream, continue to proliferate, and cause toxic shock syndrome. So what are symptoms of this syndrome? Lethargy, vomiting. It causes a sunburn-like rash. It can cause profuse watery diarrhea, confusion, fever, and headache. Okay, so all this is caused by the proliferation of a virulent Staphylococcus aureus. So, and then why is this causing shock, right? Remember, every time you have inflammation, you're going to dilate your blood vessels. That vasodilation will lead to leaking of the fluid to the tissues, so that causes edema in the tissues. Also, is going to cause a drop in the blood pressure, right? That drop in the blood pressure causes many different symptoms, including what could be leading to shock, okay? Now let's talk a little bit about streptococcus skin infection. So we have streptococcal cells that are beta hemolytic, meaning what? They are able to fully digest hemoglobin, right? They are the vampires, the blood eaters, right? So the beta hemolytic are what we include in the group A, strep. Strep. So we call it group A streptococcus. In group A streptococcus are mostly just this bacteria. Which one is the beta hemolytic that we talk about all the time? Streptococcus pyogenes. This is the most dangerous one. It's the vampire bacterium, right? They eat all the blood. There are other groups, B, C, and all the way through T, that we don't really talk much about because this is the most relevant clinically. The group B includes the Streptococcus agalacti, that causes sepsis, and we're going to talk about that when we talk about the cardiovascular and lymphatic system diseases, okay? So now we're going to focus on strep pyogenes. So strep pyogenes, as shown in this slide, can produce many virulent factors, including streptolysins, that lyse red blood cells, like I just said. That's why they are group A. They're beta hemolytic. They also produce M proteins. They produce, they're attached to the fimbriae, right? And they help in the adhesion and avoidance of the immune system. They produce hyaluronidase that helps to break down hyaluronic acid in the connective tissue, and streptokinases that dissolve blood clots. So just here, you have a soup of virulent factors that will cause multiple diseases by Streptococcus pyogenes, okay? Just to illustrate, that's just showing here that these are the fimbriae, and that's where you have M protein that is important for adherence and to evade phagocytosis. Diseases caused by strep pyogenes. Erysipelas, which is an infection in the dermal layer of the skin, and it causes tissue destruction and can also cause sepsis. There are red patches in erysipelas that are common. I think I have a picture. Let me show you now. That is common to cause local damage. It has like raised margins and can lead to sepsis. It's also called cellulitis. That is what erysipelas is. Okay. And then you have another disease that is called the flesh-eating disease, which is the necrotizing fasciitis. That disease happens because the bacteria is able to produce an exotoxin A, and that's a superantigen. What do superantigens do? They reinforce the immune response. They're able to make an immune response exacerbated, right? And how exacerbated? Are you sure you want to see it? Look at that. That's a leg of a person with necrotizing fasciitis. Look what happens because the bacterium, the strep is growing. It can also have staphylococcus in this case. It's growing. You know where this happens usually? In amputated and diabetic patients, in exposed fractures. So any situation where you have exposed tissue, the strep can get in, usually in the hospital, right? And then that superantigen, exotoxin A, that is produced by it, will induce a very strong immune response by neutrophils mostly, and those cytokines that are produced by the immune cells attack the flesh or the muscle and the skin, right? So it starts in the skin, but it gets a lot worse. Okay, Pseudomonas. Pseudomonas, remember, is that bacterium that is gram-negative, aerobe, obligate aerobe. They don't like to be in the absence of oxygen. So where do they usually grow? On the surface of the skin, inside the ears where there's still an opening, right? So they cause otitis externa because there's contact with the air in the outer part of the ear. And usually that otitis externa is called swimmer's ear because they are acquired during like swimming or mainly in hot tubs, because the warm temperature of the water leads to that Pseudomonas to grow and can get into the ear and cause external otitis externa. That's not contagious, but it's common, okay? Another place where Pseudomonas grows is in burn patients. And usually you see a green layer in that burn tissue. And it's because, remember, Pseudomonas produces pyocyanin. And pyocyanin is a green pigment that they have. And that's going to make the pus green. Okay? So that's pretty much what we need to know for Pseudomonas, and now we can move on to acne. Acne is the most common skin disease in humans. It causes a blockage in the hair follicle. Again, you can have hormonal factors affecting it, different strains of the Propionibacterium that could be present, and that are mostly but not diet. Diet is not one of the factors, okay? Doesn't mean you don't have to eat well. You still do, but it's not going to affect so much how much acne happens. There are three main stages or levels of severity of acne. First one is the mild or comedonal, and that's easily to treat with just topical solutions. And then you have inflammatory acne, which you have more metabolization of that sebum, and fatty acids produce that inflammatory response. You can treat that with antibiotics. But when you have the most severe case, which is the nodular cystic acne, that inflammation will form very deep pus. Those are the pustules that we talked about in the dermis, and that needs to be treated with more drastic measures. For example, use of isotretinoin, which is a medicine that stops the production of fat in the skin totally, and that will cause other side effects. For example, you cannot use that drug or administer that drug in pregnant women because it's teratogenic. It can cause fetus to be totally maldeveloped. But just for the purpose of treating acne, if it's really well controlled, it is really effective in the case of the nodular cystic acne. Like I said, increasing sex hormones called androgens will help the development of acne, because the androgens cause the sebaceous glands to enlarge and make more sebum, and that will lead to that cause. There's no way to prevent acne other than just treating it, right? But there's no way to prevent it. And I think that's all I have for you for skin bacteria infection. So in the next video, we're going to talk about viral disease infections. See you soon.